Hi guys, today we're going to focus on talent identification, and in particular we're going to focus on the UK talent identification pathways and compare them to the Australian talent identification pathways. There is a third talent identification program you need to know, and that is linked to East Germany in the 1970s. However, I've made another video on that, and you can just search that one up if you're really interested in that area. Now, if you're watching this in 2024, then the last year's exam question was asked on the East German versus UK talent identification pathway. This year's exam question, if it is going to come up, is probably more likely going to be on the Australian and versus UK talent identification pathways. So this is the A-level revision on that. Now, we're going to focus on this participation pyramid. We've already mentioned that a little bit at the moment, and the process of the participation pyramid and talent identification is that we will move kids up and people up through these stages. So the foundation pyramid part of the pyramid is the participation, the mass participation area, the grassroots level, but as we select people out of that area, we move them up the pyramid to participation, which is taking part in clubs and stuff like that, and into performance, where we're looking at more sort of competing on the county and the national levels, and then into the international levels and potentially medaling. So we're moving up this pyramid, which is the idea of talent identification and putting kids through those ranks. So if we start off with the UK talent identification, there's sort of two routes that we can look at. We've got the national governing bodies pathways, and then schools pathways. Now, an exam question might ask you deliberately just about the national governing bodies and how they structure it and how they focus it. But in general, UK talent ID sits with either the national governing bodies individually to focus on developing a sport program for each sport, or it could be the schools to develop the kids' abilities in their talent identification, so it's a very sort of decentralized process where we're leaving it to different organizations to run their own talent identification strategies. So the national governing bodies, so make sure you know a national governing body just in general for your maybe the roles and advantages and disadvantages of national governing bodies. Make sure you know a NGB, and they will develop their own talent identification pathways that will focus on different developmental stages of an athlete's life, so critical points, and it generally runs between 6 and 7 different stages or levels as they move up. So there might be the very base level, the fundamental skills, moving up to the later stages where we're training to win and get medals and so on and so forth. Now, what they try to do is to maximize training based on the potential of the athletes. So they focus at each level, there's a different training need, and they provide facilities, structure, resources, and athlete care at each of those levels. The idea is to control the pathway for that athlete or sports performer as they move up, and they target their funding pools. So there's the national government has a set of money, and they'll put the money at different levels of that pathway as appropriate. Depends on their own goals and their own focuses. And what they will do is they will target sports science support at the appropriate phases. So it's hard to say a particular example. This is a generic sort of approach national governing bodies take. You could focus on a particular sport if you wanted to, and if you searched it on Google, you probably come up with a national governing body talent identification pathway quite easily. But in general, the exam boards want to know this generic sort of approach taken by national governing bodies. Now, the other side of it is the school's approach to talent identification, and what's quite different with England compared to Australia and East Germany in the 1970s is that we really focus at school level on mass participation, taking part rather than winning. And that's probably just an approach that the UK schools have. It's about mass participation, building up the foundation part of the pyramid, rather than maybe the elite level and focusing on the best performers. there is a big lack in funding in schools. Schools in general are lacking funding, and then within the school themselves, that school is given a pot of money, and then it goes to the PE departments to then spend their own side of it. So the money is quite limited at certain schools when it comes down to it. And this is really looking at sort of state school provision. We don't have many specialist teachers. It is reliant on just PE teachers to develop the sport and develop the individual kids. What we don't have in elite level is this hire and fire culture. So if a teacher isn't performing to develop an individual's talents, they're not going to get a sack. It relies on teachers to take the sports team. So a random teacher might not have any interest in a particular sport like hockey or football, yet they might be responsible for taking a team, and whether they're good or bad coaches, it doesn't matter. We just need people out there taking the team. So the development of talent is quite limited in schools in general. We have a very inclusive approach. So usually school teams, you have a first team, second team, maybe a third team, and it's inclusive rather than elitist. So it might be whoever shows up to training will get the games rather than the best. So that's the approach that schools take. We have a very varied level on extracurricular sport. So the idea of mass exposing people to more sports is approaching UK schools, and the seriousness levels of extracurricular varies. It could be looking at focusing on improving performance levels, but it could just be gaining an experience and providing that sport for life sort of concept. National curriculum is deliberately focused at giving a broad and balanced curriculum, so students will learn lots of different sports and lots of different skills, and the government really focus on national curriculum being developing individual skills to take part in sport in their later life. Now, when we are looking at talent identification, we are probably looking at about an 8-mark exam question. However, it could quite easily be a 15-mark exam question. So if it was a 15-mark exam question, you might want to start with the routes at taking part in the UK, if that's the exam question, if it's comparing the UK versus another country. Now, I've just gone over the state schools, and that's the same information there. There is some contradictions, though, in the school programme, which are contradicted by the public schools. So state schools is the free schools, the ones that we go to where you don't have to pay to go to the school, whereas public schools are the fee-paying schools. Now, even though I mentioned all these negatives as why school sport doesn't have that focus on talent identification, they do have it at public schools, where some schools in public schools compete at a higher level. So they have top teams competing at a higher level. There are many public schools with outstanding facilities compared to the state schools. So if you go to somewhere like Millfield, Dulwich College, you could probably think of a private school close by to you with some fantastic facilities, and that allows for the talent to really be developed. There is scholarships available for talented athletes, often at public schools. Alumni, people who've left that school, what they do is they donate money back towards that school if they have it, and that money can be reinvested back into sport. There are bursaries available, and then universities, they also offer scholarships and bursaries to try and develop talented athletes as well. So they are contradictions to all these points that I've made earlier. The contradiction here in public schools is they do employ specialist coaches. They do have more funding available for their coaches, and often the teachers maybe are ex-professionals or have completed at elite level. So there is, even though talent identification is limited at state schools, we really focus on the public schools to drag through the talented athletes. So you've either got the national governing body side of it, or you've got the school side of it in the UK, and they're really the two main focuses on children's talent identification. Now, exam question might ask you about the Australian talent identification programs, and it's useful to know the sort of historical background. Now, in Australia in the 1970s, they had a really poor Australian performance, and what happens was the Australian government were like, we need to improve this, and they reviewed their elite sports system, and they reviewed what other countries were doing at the time, and they decided that they changed the system, wasn't working, and they wanted international recognition. So the government and the public were not too happy with the fact that they had not performed very well at the 1976 Olympics. So they approached it and they made the Australian Institute of Sport, the AIS. And to be honest, it works quite similar, and it's based on a similar model to the East German high performance models of the 1970s, probably with the main exceptions is there was no drugs involved. But so that's just a brief historical background. Other key points here, we said it links to similar to the East German high performance centers. It was a way of centralizing their focus and developing their facilities and support services for sport, and it focused on only 35 sort of different sports programs, 26 different sports. So that's sort of limited to there's a big number of sports, but limited to particularly Olympic sports that they were going to be focusing on. They provided scholarships for athletes they thought were going to be talented future world beaters. So that's just a brief explanation of the history behind Australia's approach to talent ID, and that we have the AIS, and there is very similar sort of similarities between the Australian model and the East German model. So if you've watched and revised the East German model, it's very similar in terms of the development of elite world-class facilities and support services, providing top-level coaching, access to top equipment, sports scientists, medicine, accommodation, meals, travel, all of the needs and support services in one place. Now, if we're comparing that to the UK, or comparing the Australian model to the UK, now there currently are some similarities with the UK, other than the AIS developments, but there are very similar elements to the UK model where there are some differences. So generally, exam question will want you to compare and contrast the two. So the first is the funding pot comes from the Australian government, called the Australian Sports Commission, and they fund all of Australian sport, whereas in the UK we rely more on lottery funding and a little bit of money from I say a little bit, but less money than lottery, based on government funding, which comes from the Department of Culture, Media and Sports. But generally, Australian is that government state funded, whereas the UK focus on lottery funding. So that's a big difference that you need to sort of talk about. The Australian have a sort of a talent identification model called the FTEM model: Foundation, Talent, Elite and Mastery. So that's their equivalent of their performance pyramid. So the foundation is the grassroots level, the talent is the equivalent of the participation level, the elite is the equivalent of performance, and then mastery is their elite level. Whereas we have a world-class program, the UK, it's called the UK World Class Program, and we have that in 3 stages called World Class Talent, World Class Development and World Class Podium, and that's really only focused on athletes who potentially will medal at the Olympics. So the money is really targeted on people who we actually think will medal at Olympics and big sort of sporting events. So there's a difference in the structures if you look at those 2 structures. The next bit is the locations, etc. So we have the Australian Institute of Sport as their main hub, and they follow a decentralized model now where each state has an AIS sort of base or centre. So we've already talked about the development of the Australian Institute of Sport, where the equivalent in the UK is called the UK Sports Institutes, and again that's more of a decentralised approach, but the hub is in Sheffield, and then we have regional institutes in Bath and Manchester, and examples of places they have them, and they tend to focus different sports in different institutes. So like netball is around Manchester and Bath, and Lilleshall, for example, used to be football, it's not anymore, but Lilleshall has gymnastics and events like that. So you've got different or similarities between approaches, but they're obviously called different things. Just been comparing their sort of institutes, if you like. The number of athletes or scholarships in Australia is less than ours, so they got 700 scholarships, whereas we have about 1,300 athletes on elite programs. So it's slightly different. There's a scholarship sort of program in Australia, whereas we have elite programs and pathways for our athletes. Now, Australia, what they do is a thing called a sports search as part of their first phase, their base level, where they go out to schools and they run through kids through different tests and try to determine who's going to be potential athletes and then put them into the sports. And in England, we've attempted it. It's not really a thing that we do that much, but we have attempted it. And in certain sports, it's used more than anything else. It's not a generic national program. It's just certain sports will use it to try and identify talent routes. There are very similar other aspects that are very similar and crossover to each other. So they call it Play Sport Australia at the base level, whereas we call it grassroots participation, but they are essentially the same things, focusing on the base level of the participation pyramid. And both UK and Australia have grants available to athletes. They both have ACE programs, which is basically an education-based program aimed at educating athletes. We have long-term athlete development programs. Both of them are both in Australia and the UK, and they're both focused on in Australia, they focus on the individual organisations, whereas we focus it on the national governing bodies, essentially the same thing. So each sport has their own LTAD, the Long-Term Athlete Development Programme, in place. So there are similarities, quite a lot of similarities between the Australia and the UK. So in reflection, you need to know I would know a bit about the UK talent identification programs and how it works with national governing bodies. I'd know the difference, how the schools approach it in the UK, and then have a brief understanding of how and why Australia focused a lot on the Australian AIS and why they developed it and reinvented their talent identification program, and then the comparisons or similarities between Australia and the UK talent identification pathways. Generally, it's going to be an 8-mark exam question. It could be a 15-marker, but if you break it down into those sort of 4 steps, that will help you answer a 15-marker. But I think in the past it's been 8 marks with a 15-marker in the specimen paper, which was focused on the East German model rather than the Australian model. So this area has only ever been asked once. Last year's exam question in 23 was heavily asked about East Germany. So if they do ask you about Australia, it's going to come up. If it is going to come up, it's more likely to be Australia versus the UK. I hope this has helped, and good luck in your exams.